The morning light crept through the bedroom window as 63-year-old Margaret Collins reached for her husband's side of the bed. Her fingers found only cold sheets. She blinked slowly, listening. Somewhere downstairs, unfamiliar voices echoed through her home. A man's laugh, the scrape of furniture against hardwood, and then a woman's voice, calm and certain. "We'll want to start clearing out the upstairs bedroom today." Margaret's heart stopped. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Margaret Collins had never been a woman who asked for much. She didn't need fancy vacations or expensive jewelry. She didn't dream of beach houses or luxury cars. All she had ever wanted, truly wanted, was a home. A place where her children could grow up safe. A place where she could grow old with the man she loved. A place that was hers. And now, standing in the hallway of the house she had called home for 37 years, listening to strangers discuss which of her belongings to throw away first, Margaret understood with terrible clarity exactly what she stood to lose. Everything, not just walls and windows, not just furniture and photographs, but the very foundation of who she was. This house held her entire life within its rooms. The kitchen, where she had taught her daughter to bake her first pie, flour dusting their aprons as they laughed at their lopsided crust. The living room, where her son had taken his first steps, wobbling toward her outstretched arms while Harold cheered from the doorway. The backyard, where she had planted roses the year her mother died, because her mother had always loved roses, and Margaret needed something beautiful to tend while her heart was breaking. Every corner of this house whispered a memory. Every creak in the floorboard sang a song she knew by heart. This wasn't just a building. It was a living, breathing archive of her life. And Harold had sold it, signed it away to strangers, without ever speaking a word to her. If she lost this house, she wouldn't just lose property, she would lose proof that she had ever existed at all. But the house was only part of what trembled on the edge of destruction. There was also her dignity. Margaret had spent 41 years being a good wife. She had cooked, she had cleaned, she had raised children and stretched budgets and smiled through exhaustion. She had given Harold the best years of her life, not because she had to, but because she believed in their partnership. She believed that marriage was a sacred bond, built on trust and mutual respect. And now she discovered that trust had been a one-way street. Harold had forged her signature, he had lied to her face, he had treated her not as a partner, but as an obstacle to be managed, an inconvenience to be bypassed, a fool too old and too naive to notice what was happening under her own roof. If this betrayal stood unchallenged, what would that say about her? That she was weak? That she was invisible? That 41 years of devotion meant nothing at all? Margaret couldn't bear that. She couldn't bear becoming a cautionary tale that other women whispered about. Poor thing, she had no idea. Her own husband robbed her blind. Her dignity was on the line, and dignity once lost is not easily reclaimed. Then there was the practical reality, the cold, hard numbers that kept her awake at night. Margaret was 63 years old. She had no career to return to, no savings in her own name. For decades, she had trusted Harold to manage their finances. He handled the bank accounts, he paid the bills. She had never questioned it, because why would she? He was her husband, her partner, the man who had promised in front of God and their families to love and protect her until death. But now she understood the danger of that trust. Without this house, Margaret would have nothing, no income, no assets, no safety net. At her age, starting over wasn't just difficult, it felt nearly impossible. Who would hire a 63-year-old woman with no recent work experience? Where would she live? How would she survive? She could end up dependent on her children, a burden they never asked for. She could end up in some cramped apartment, counting pennies, wondering where her life had gone. She could end up alone, forgotten, reduced to a shadow of the woman she had once been. The thought made her stomach turn, And beneath all of these fears, beneath the loss of home, dignity, and security, there was something even deeper, something that hurt more than all the rest. If Harold could do this to her, what did that mean about their entire marriage? Had he ever truly loved her, or had she been fooling herself all along? Were the tender moments, the forehead kisses, the quiet evenings, the way he held her hand at their daughter's wedding, were any of them real? Or had she spent 4 decades loving a stranger? Margaret didn't know. And that uncertainty was perhaps the cruelest wound of all. Because if the love wasn't real, then what had she given her life to? What had any of it meant? These were the stakes, not just a house, not just money, but Margaret's entire sense of self, her past, her present, her future, all of it balanced on a knife's edge. And as she stood in that hallway, listening to strangers plan the dismantling of her life, she understood one thing with absolute certainty. She could not let them win. 6 months before that terrible morning, life in the Collins household moved like a gentle river, steady, predictable, and quietly beautiful. Margaret would wake each day just before dawn, when the sky outside her bedroom window was still painted in shades of deep violet and soft gray. She never set an alarm. After 40 years of rising early, her body simply knew when it was time. She would lie still for a moment, listening to Harold's slow, rhythmic breathing beside her, feeling the familiar warmth of the blankets that had covered them through countless seasons. Then, with the care of someone who did not wish to disturb the peace, she would slip out of bed and make her way downstairs. The stairs creaked in all the places she expected them to creak. The third step from the bottom, the spot near the landing where the wood had warped slightly over the years. These sounds were not annoyances to Margaret, they were greetings. The house sang good morning in its own quiet language. The kitchen was her kingdom. She would flip on the small light above the stove, never the overhead light, which was too harsh for the early hours, and the room would glow in warm amber tones. The countertops were clean, wiped down the night before. The dish towels hung neatly from the oven handle, embroidered with little apples and pears. Her daughter had given them to her years ago, a Mother's Day gift that Margaret had treasured ever since. She would fill the old percolator with water and measure out the coffee grounds. 2 scoops for herself, an extra half scoop because Harold liked it strong. The machine would begin its familiar symphony of hisses and gurgles, and Margaret would stand at the window above the sink, watching the world wake up. Through that window she could see her garden. It wasn't large, just a modest patch of earth along the back fence, but it was hers. She had planted it herself, season after season, year after year. Tomatoes in the summer, chrysanthemums in the fall, and roses, always roses. Pink ones and white ones, and deep velvety reds that reminded her of her mother's garden back in Pennsylvania. In the early morning light, the garden seemed to shimmer. Dew clung to the petals. A robin hopped along the fence post. Everything was still. Everything was peaceful. Margaret would take a slow breath and feel something settle in her chest, gratitude perhaps, or simply the quiet contentment of a woman who had built a good life and knew it. By 7 o'clock the coffee would be ready, and Harold would come downstairs. He moved slower these days, his knees bothered him, and the years had settled into his bones, but he still descended those stairs the same way he always had. One hand on the railing, slippers scuffing softly against the wood, his gray hair mussed from sleep, his reading glasses already perched on his nose because he liked to read the newspaper first thing. "Morning, Maggie," he would say, and Margaret would smile, the way she had smiled at him for 41 years. "Morning, sweetheart." He would kiss her forehead, a quick, familiar gesture, as natural as breathing, and settle into his chair at the kitchen table. The same chair he had claimed when they first moved into this house, back when their children were small and the future stretched out before them like an open road. Margaret would place his plate in front of him, Eggs over easy, the yolks still soft and golden. Toast cut on the diagonal because he had always preferred it that way. A small glass of orange juice, a napkin folded beside his fork. These were not grand gestures. They were the tiny, invisible acts of love that hold a marriage together, the things that no one notices until they are gone. After breakfast, the day would unfold in its gentle rhythm. Harold would retreat to his study to read or putter with his old woodworking tools. Margaret would tidy the kitchen, then settle into her favorite armchair in the living room with her knitting or a library book. The clock on the mantel would tick softly. Sunlight would drift through the curtains, casting long, golden rectangles across the carpet. Sometimes in the afternoon Margaret would call her daughter, and they would talk about nothing important, grocery lists and grandchildren and the weather. Sometimes a neighbor would stop by, and Margaret would make tea and serve cookies on the good china, because visitors deserve to feel special. In the evenings, she and Harold would watch television together, old movies mostly, the kind with happy endings and orchestral scores. They didn't talk much during these hours, but they didn't need to. They had long ago reached that stage of marriage where silence was comfortable, where simply being together was enough. This was Margaret's life, simple, quiet, ordinary. And she loved it. She loved the creak of the stairs and the hiss of the percolator, and the way the morning light fell across her garden. She loved the rhythm of her days, the steadiness of her routines, the deep and abiding comfort of knowing exactly where she belonged. She had no idea that all of it was about to be taken away. Margaret and Harold had met in the summer of 1982, on a Sunday afternoon that smelled of fresh-cut grass and lemonade. It was a church picnic in their small Ohio town, the kind of gathering where everyone knew everyone, where children chased each other across open fields and older folks sat in folding chairs beneath the shade of oak trees, fanning themselves against the July heat. Margaret was 22 years old, recently graduated from community college, still living in her parents' house and wondering what her life would become. She wore a yellow sundress that day. Her mother had sewn it for her, carefully stitching each seam, pressing each fold. Margaret remembered feeling pretty in that dress, not glamorous, not stunning, but softly, quietly pretty. The kind of pretty that didn't demand attention, but waited patiently to be noticed. And Harold noticed. He was 25, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they understood hard work. He had a kind face, not handsome in a movie star way, but honest, trustworthy. The kind of face that made you feel safe just looking at it. He approached her near the refreshment table, holding 2 paper cups of lemonade. "You look like you could use one of these," he said, offering her a cup with a shy smile. Margaret took it. Their fingers brushed, and something small but certain shifted in her chest. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Harold," he said. "Margaret," she replied. And that was the beginning of everything. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. He did it simply, without grand gestures or elaborate plans. One autumn evening, they sat together on her parents' porch, watching the leaves fall in spirals of gold and crimson. Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, modest, delicate, with a tiny diamond that caught the fading light. "I don't have much," he said, his voice steady, but his hands trembling. "But I'll spend my whole life trying to make you happy, if you'll let me." Margaret didn't hesitate. She said yes before he finished speaking. They were married the following spring, in the same church where they had met. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame. Harold cried when he saw her walk down the aisle. Just a few tears quickly wiped away, but Margaret saw them. She never forgot. The early years were not easy. They had little money and even less certainty. Harold worked long hours at the factory, coming home with aching muscles and grease beneath his fingernails. Margaret took part-time jobs where she could, waitressing, cleaning houses, answering phones at a doctor's office, to help make ends meet. There were nights when they counted coins on the kitchen table, calculating whether they could afford both groceries and the electric bill. But they never fought about money, not once. Instead, they held hands across that kitchen table and reminded each other that this was temporary, that they were building something together, that love was not about what you had, but about who you faced the world with. Margaret believed that. She believed it with her whole heart. When the children came, first Daniel, then Sarah, Margaret gave herself entirely to motherhood. She left her job to stay home with them. She learned to stretch meals, to mend clothes, to turn ordinary afternoons into adventures. She read stories until her voice grew hoarse. She bandaged scraped knees and soothed nightmares and cheered at school plays where her children delivered their lines in nervous, wobbling voices. Harold worked harder than ever during those years. He took overtime shifts, he missed dinners and weekends. But when he came home, he never complained. He would scoop the children into his arms, kiss Margaret on the forehead, and say, "I'm the luckiest man in the world." And Margaret believed him. She believed that their sacrifices meant something, that the long hours and the tired nights and the dreams deferred were all investments in a future they would share. She believed that Harold saw her, truly saw her, not as a housekeeper or a caretaker, but as his partner, his equal, the woman he had chosen above all others. Over the decades, their love settled into something quieter but no less deep. They developed rituals, Saturday morning pancakes, evening walks around the neighborhood when the weather was kind, the way Harold always made sure her coffee cup was filled before his own, the way Margaret laid out his clothes each morning because she knew he could never match patterns on his own. These were not passionate gestures. They were something better. They were proof of a love that had endured, through hardship and loss, through raising children and burying parents, through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make up a life. Margaret had given Harold everything, her youth, her dreams, her unwavering trust. She never imagined he would betray her. It started with small things, things so minor, so easily explained away, that Margaret barely registered them at first. A glance that lasted a second too long, a pause before answering a simple question. The faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air between them, like the moment before a storm when the birds go silent and the leaves hang perfectly still. Margaret noticed, but she told herself she was imagining things. After 41 years of marriage, you learn to forgive small oddities. People change, moods shift. Age brings its own quiet burdens. She had read articles about men in their 60s becoming withdrawn, struggling with retirement, grappling with questions of purpose and mortality. She assumed Harold was simply going through a phase. She assumed wrong. The first real moment of unease came on a Tuesday evening in early spring. Margaret had been folding laundry in the bedroom when she heard Harold's voice drifting up from his study downstairs. He was on the phone, nothing unusual about that, but something in his tone made her pause. He was speaking quietly, too quietly. His words were muffled, rushed, as if he didn't want to be overheard. She set down the shirt she was folding and moved closer to the door, straining to listen. She caught only fragments. Taken care of. And, "She doesn't need to know." And then, sharply, "I said, I'll handle it." Margaret's heart flickered with something she couldn't name. Curiosity, concern. She descended the stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the banister. When she reached the study door, she knocked softly and pushed it open. Harold was sitting at his desk, the phone pressed to his ear. The moment he saw her, his expression changed, just for an instant, just a flash, before settling into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, and hung up. "Who was that?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice light. "Oh, just an old friend from the factory," Harold said. He waved his hand dismissively. "You remember Bill Hendricks? He's been having some health troubles. Just checking in on him." Margaret nodded. She didn't remember Bill Hendricks particularly well, but that wasn't unusual. Harold had known many people over the years. "That's kind of you," she said. Harold smiled again, that same strange smile, and turned back to his desk. "Dinner almost ready?" "10 minutes," Margaret replied. She returned to the kitchen and tried to push the conversation from her mind. But something lingered, a splinter beneath the skin, a question she couldn't quite form. She doesn't need to know. Who had he been talking about? In the weeks that followed, the mail became another source of quiet confusion. Margaret had always handled the household correspondence. Bills, letters from family, catalogs, the occasional card from an old friend. She sorted through them each afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. It was a small routine, unremarkable, but it was hers. Then, one day, she noticed that certain envelopes had stopped arriving. The monthly bank statement, which always came on the 15th, didn't appear. Neither did the notice from their insurance company, which usually arrived at the end of each quarter. Margaret assumed they were simply delayed. Postal services had become less reliable in recent years. Everyone said so. But when she mentioned it to Harold, his reaction struck her as odd. "I'll look into it," he said quickly, too quickly. "Probably just a mix-up. I'll call the bank tomorrow." He didn't meet her eyes when he said it. Margaret let it go. What else could she do? She trusted Harold. She had always trusted Harold. And trust, she reminded herself, meant not questioning every small inconsistency. But the statements never came. And when Margaret asked again, a week later, Harold grew irritated. "I told you I'd handle it," he snapped. "Why do you always have to keep asking?" Margaret flinched. In 41 years of marriage, Harold had rarely raised his voice to her. She stood in the kitchen, dish towel in hand, feeling suddenly like a stranger in her own home. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to bother you." Harold sighed, rubbed his forehead, and softened. "No, I'm sorry. I've just been tired lately." "Forgive me?" She nodded. She forgave him. But that night, lying in bed beside him, Margaret stared at the ceiling and felt the first true stirrings of doubt. Something was wrong. She could feel it, a cold current running beneath the surface of their life, invisible but undeniable. Harold was hiding something. She didn't know what. She didn't want to know what. But the splinter was deeper now, and it was starting to ache. The distance between them grew like a slow frost, silent, creeping, impossible to stop. At first, Margaret tried to bridge the gap. She cooked Harold's favorite meals. She suggested evening walks, the way they used to take before his knees started bothering him. She asked about his day, his thoughts, his feelings. She reached for him in the darkness of their bedroom, her hand seeking his across the cool expanse of sheets. But Harold pulled away. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just quietly. He would eat her meals without comment, pushing food around his plate with disinterest. He would decline the walks, citing tiredness or the weather, or some vague excuse that dissolved the moment it left his lips. When she asked how he was feeling, he would shrug and say, "Fine," in a voice that made the words sound like a locked door. And when her hand reached for his at night, he would turn onto his side, his back a wall between them. Margaret told herself it was nothing. She told herself that marriages go through seasons, that intimacy ebbs and flows, that 41 years together meant they didn't need constant reassurance. But deep down, in the quiet chambers of her heart, she knew something had changed. Then came the small cruelties. They arrived wrapped in ordinary moments, disguised as irritation or impatience. A sharp word here, a dismissive glance there, the kind of cuts that don't bleed visibly but leave bruises beneath the skin. One morning, Margaret asked Harold if he wanted eggs or oatmeal for breakfast. A simple question. A question she had asked 1,000 times before. Harold looked up from his newspaper with an expression she didn't recognize, cold, almost contemptuous. "Does it matter?" he said. "You'll just make whatever you want anyway." Margaret stood frozen at the stove, spatula in hand. The words hung in the air like smoke. "I only asked because—" "Just make the eggs," Harold interrupted. He snapped his newspaper and returned to reading, as if she had already ceased to exist. Margaret made the eggs. She served them without a word. And when Harold left the table without thanking her, she cleared his plate in silence, her hands trembling slightly as she rinsed it in the sink. She didn't cry. Not then. But something inside her cracked, a hairline fracture in the foundation of her self-worth. The incidents multiplied as the weeks passed. Harold criticized the way she folded his shirts. He complained that she talked too much during dinner. He sighed heavily when she entered a room, as if her very presence exhausted him. Once, when Margaret reminded him about their grandson's birthday party, Harold muttered under his breath, "Why do you always have to nag me about everything?" Nag. The word stung like a slap. Margaret had never nagged. She had reminded, suggested, organized, the invisible labor that kept their household running smoothly for 4 decades. But Harold made it sound like a failing, like something to be ashamed of. She began to shrink, not physically, but in ways that were harder to see. She measured her words before speaking, weighing each one for potential offense. She stopped humming while she cooked. She avoided Harold's study, tiptoeing past the closed door as if she were an intruder in her own home. She laughed less. She smiled less. She became, bit by bit, a smaller version of herself. And the worst part, the part that kept her awake at night, was that no one noticed. Her children lived far away, busy with their own lives. Her neighbors saw only the polite smiles she offered over the fence. The world continued turning, oblivious to the quiet erosion happening behind the walls of the Collins house. Margaret was disappearing, and she was the only witness. Some nights she would lie awake and wonder if she was the problem. Maybe she had become boring. Maybe she had let herself go. Maybe Harold had simply grown tired of her after all these years, and who could blame him? She wasn't young anymore. She wasn't exciting. She was just Margaret, ordinary, predictable, invisible Margaret. These thoughts circled her mind like vultures, picking at the bones of her confidence. She began to apologize for things that weren't her fault. She began to thank Harold for the smallest acknowledgments, a nod, a grunt, a moment of eye contact. She became grateful for crumbs when she had once been served full meals of love and respect. This was not the marriage she remembered. This was not the man she had married. But Margaret didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to fight an enemy she couldn't see, couldn't name, couldn't understand. All she could do was endure, day after day, silence after silence, hoping that somehow, some way, the man she loved would return to her. He never did. The truth revealed itself on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in the most unremarkable of circumstances. Margaret was cleaning Harold's study, a task she performed every week, dusting the shelves, vacuuming the worn carpet, straightening the stacks of papers that accumulated on his desk like fallen leaves. Harold had gone out for one of his mysterious errands, the kind he never explained, and she had learned not to question. The house was quiet. The autumn sun slanted through the window, casting long, golden rectangles across the floor. She moved through the room with the mechanical efficiency of long habit. Dust cloth along the bookshelf, vacuum around the desk chair, a quick tidying of the papers which she never read. Harold's business was Harold's business, and Margaret respected boundaries. But today, something caught her eye. A folder had slipped behind the desk, wedged between the wooden leg and the wall. It must have fallen at some point, perhaps knocked loose by Harold's elbow or a careless movement. Margaret bent down, her knees protesting slightly, and retrieved it. The folder was plain manila, unmarked, unremarkable. She should have simply placed it on the desk and continued her cleaning. That's what the old Margaret would have done. The trusting Margaret, the obedient Margaret, the Margaret who believed that her husband had no secrets worth knowing. But something made her pause. Perhaps it was the weight of the folder, heavier than expected. Perhaps it was the months of distance and coldness, the unanswered questions that had piled up in her mind like unpaid debts. Perhaps it was simply instinct, the quiet voice that had been whispering warnings she refused to hear. Whatever the reason, Margaret opened the folder. At first, the documents inside made no sense. Legal jargon, numbers, signatures, pages dense with language she didn't fully understand. Margaret's eyes scanned the words, searching for meaning, her heart beginning to beat faster, though she didn't yet know why. Then she saw it. 3 words, printed clearly at the top of one page: transfer of property. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She read further, her hands trembling now, the papers rustling like dry leaves in her grip. The address listed was their address. This house, the home they had shared for 37 years. A buyer's name appeared, unfamiliar, meaningless. Dollar amounts were specified, sums larger than Margaret had ever seen in one place. And at the bottom of the page, in ink, she recognized as surely as her own reflection, was Harold's signature, dated 2 months ago. Margaret sank into Harold's desk chair, the folder falling open in her lap. Her mind raced, stumbled, refused to process what her eyes were seeing. Harold had sold their house, their home, the place where they had raised their children, celebrated anniversaries, weathered storms both literal and figurative. He had sold it without telling her, without asking her, without even hinting that such a thing was possible. But how? Her name was on the deed. She had signed the original mortgage herself, all those decades ago when they were young and hopeful, and building a life together. Harold couldn't sell the house without her consent. Could he? With shaking hands, Margaret continued through the folder. Near the bottom, she found another document, a power of attorney, granting Harold full and complete control over all their shared assets, real estate, bank accounts, investments, everything, and there at the bottom of the page was her signature. Margaret stared at it. The handwriting was close to hers, close enough to fool a casual observer, but something was wrong. The slant of the letters, the spacing between words, the way the M in Margaret looped at the top. It wasn't her signature. She had never seen this document before. She had never agreed to give Harold power of attorney. She would have remembered something that important, that significant. But here it was, dated 8 months ago, bearing a forgery of her name. Harold had forged her signature. He had taken away her legal rights without her knowledge. He had sold their home behind her back. He had betrayed her in a way so complete, so calculated, that Margaret could barely comprehend it. She sat in that chair for a long time, the folder in her lap, the afternoon light slowly fading around her. The house was silent. The clock on Harold's desk ticked steadily, indifferent to the devastation unfolding in its presence. Outside, a bird sang. A car passed on the street. The world continued as if nothing had happened. But for Margaret, everything had changed. The man she had loved for 41 years, the man she had trusted with her heart, her home, her entire life, was a stranger. Worse than a stranger, a thief, a liar, a betrayer, and she was his victim. The question now was simple, though the answer would be anything but. What was she going to do about it? That night Margaret did not sleep. She lay in the darkness beside Harold, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. He slept peacefully, undisturbed, his face slack and innocent, in the pale moonlight that filtered through the curtains. He looked like the man she had married, gentle, kind, trustworthy. He looked like a man incapable of cruelty, but Margaret now knew what lay beneath that familiar face. She stared at the ceiling, her eyes wide and burning, her mind a hurricane of thoughts she couldn't control. The documents played on a loop in her memory, the transfer of property, the forged signature, the dates and dollar amounts that proved her husband's betrayal. She had returned the folder to its place behind the desk before Harold came home, her hands moving mechanically, her heart numb with shock. She had cooked dinner, she had smiled across the table, she had said goodnight and climbed into bed beside him, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. And now, in the suffocating darkness of their bedroom, Margaret felt something inside her begin to crack. The tears came slowly at first. They welled up from somewhere deep, somewhere she had kept locked and guarded for months. They slid down her temples and pooled in her ears, warm and silent. She pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound, her body trembling with the effort of containment. She thought of her children. Daniel, her firstborn, now a father himself, living in Colorado with his wife and 2 boys. Sarah, her baby girl, a schoolteacher in Michigan, always so busy, always promising to visit soon. What would they say when they learned what their father had done? Would they believe her? Or would they look at her with pity, seeing only a confused old woman making wild accusations? The thought made her stomach clench with dread. She thought of her friends, her neighbors, the people at church who had known her and Harold for decades. The Collinses, everyone called them, as if they were a single unit, inseparable, enviable. What would those people think when the truth came out? Would they take her side, or would they whisper behind her back, wondering what she had done to drive Harold to such extremes? Margaret had always cared what people thought, perhaps too much. She had spent her life being agreeable, being pleasant, being the kind of woman others approved of. Now she wondered if that woman had been a mask, and if anyone would recognize the face beneath. In the darkness, memories surfaced unbidden. She remembered the day Harold proposed, his hands trembling as he opened the velvet box. She remembered their wedding night, the nervous laughter, the whispered promises. She remembered the birth of their children, Harold pacing the hospital hallway, crying with joy when the nurse placed Daniel in his arms. She remembered the hard years, too, the factory layoffs, the mounting bills, the nights they sat at the kitchen table, counting coins, wondering if they would make it through. But they had made it through, together, always together. Or so she had believed. Now every memory felt tainted. Every tender moment was shadowed by doubt. Had Harold been lying then, too? Had his love ever been real? Or had she been a convenience, a housekeeper, a caretaker, a fool too trusting to see the truth? The questions were unbearable. They circled her mind like vultures, tearing at the carcass of her former life. Beside her, Harold stirred in his sleep. He mumbled something, a word, a name she couldn't tell, and rolled onto his side, his back now facing her. The mattress shifted with his movement. The sheets rustled. Then he was still again, lost in whatever dreams visited men who betrayed their wives. Margaret watched him, tears drying on her cheeks. She had never felt more alone. Here, in the bed she had shared with this man for 4 decades, she was utterly, completely alone. The person beside her was not a partner, not a protector, not a friend. He was a stranger wearing her husband's face, sleeping soundly while her world collapsed around her. The weight of it pressed down on her chest like a stone. She could barely breathe. She could barely think. She wanted to scream, to shake him awake, to demand answers. But she did none of these things. Instead, she lay silent in the darkness, drowning in grief. This was the lowest moment, the absolute bottom, the place where hope goes to die and despair takes root. Margaret felt it consuming her, the fear, the rage, the crushing sadness that threatened to swallow her whole. But somewhere, in the deepest part of her being, a small flame flickered. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and by morning it would begin to grow. Dawn arrived slowly, painting the bedroom in shades of gray and pale gold. Margaret had not slept. Her eyes were dry now, the tears exhausted, leaving behind a strange emptiness that felt almost like calm. She lay motionless beneath the covers, watching the light creep across the ceiling, listening to the first birds begin their morning songs outside the window. Beside her, Harold slept on. She studied his face in the growing light, the lines etched by time, the gray stubble along his jaw, the slight parting of his lips as he breathed. This was the face she had loved for 41 years, the face she had trusted, the face she had built her entire life around. And now, looking at it, she felt something shift inside her, not anger, not sadness, something quieter, something harder, resolution. Margaret rose from the bed without making a sound. She moved through the familiar motions of her morning routine, slipping on her robe, sliding her feet into her worn house slippers, descending the creaking stairs to the kitchen below. The percolator hissed and gurgled as she measured the coffee grounds. The window above the sink framed her garden, still touched with morning dew. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday, and the day before, and every day for as long as she could remember. But Margaret was no longer the same woman who had stood at this window. She poured herself a cup of coffee and carried it to the kitchen table. She sat down in her usual chair, wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, and stared at the steam rising in delicate spirals. For the first time in months, perhaps years, her mind was perfectly clear. She thought about what Harold had done, the forged signature, the secret sale, the calculated betrayal that had unfolded right under her nose while she cooked his meals and washed his clothes, and tried desperately to understand why he had grown so distant. He had planned this. He had executed it with precision. He had looked her in the eyes every single day and lied. And he had done it because he believed she was weak. He believed she was old, foolish, invisible. He believed she would never find out, or that if she did, she would be too helpless to fight back. He had spent 41 years watching her defer to him, accommodate him, trust him without question, and he had mistaken her kindness for weakness. He had underestimated her. Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee. The warmth spread through her chest, steadying her. She was 63 years old. She had survived things Harold knew nothing about, silent struggles, private griefs, moments of quiet strength that she had never spoken of because she didn't need recognition. She had raised children. She had buried her parents. She had held her family together through hardships that would have broken lesser people. She was not weak. She had simply been asleep. And now, finally, she was awake. The plan began to form in her mind like a photograph developing in solution. She would not confront Harold, not yet. Confrontation without preparation was a fool's game, and Margaret was done being foolish. She needed information. She needed allies. She needed to understand exactly what legal options were available to her before she revealed her hand. She would find a lawyer, someone sharp, someone trustworthy, someone who would look at her and see not a confused old woman, but a client deserving of justice. She would gather documents, make copies, create a paper trail that Harold couldn't deny or destroy. She would open a bank account in her own name. She hadn't had one in decades, hadn't needed one, she'd thought, because Harold handled the finances. But that dependence had been a vulnerability, and Margaret would not be vulnerable again. She would tell no one, not her children, not her friends, not a single soul who might accidentally warn Harold before she was ready. This was her battle to fight, and she would fight it on her own terms. Outside the window the sun climbed higher, flooding the garden with light. Margaret watched the roses sway gently in the morning breeze, the pink ones, the white ones, the deep velvety reds that reminded her of her mother. She had planted those roses with her own hands. She had tended them through drought and frost and neglect. They had survived because she had refused to let them die, and so would she. Margaret set down her coffee cup. Her jaw tightened. Her shoulders straightened. She did not feel powerful. She did not feel brave. She felt tired and heartbroken and terrified of what lay ahead. But beneath all of that, burning steady and true, was something unshakable. Resolve. Harold had stolen her home. He had stolen her trust. He had tried to steal her future, but he would not steal her dignity, not without a fight. The weeks that followed moved with the slow, heavy weight of a gathering storm. On the surface, nothing changed. Margaret continued her daily routines, cooking breakfast, tending the garden, folding laundry, smiling at Harold across the dinner table. She played the role of dutiful wife with the precision of an actress who had rehearsed her lines for decades. She laughed when laughter was expected. She nodded when nodding was required. She gave Harold no reason to suspect that anything was different. But beneath that placid surface, Margaret was building her case, and every day the pressure grew. Her first step was finding a lawyer. She chose carefully, spending hours at the public library, a place Harold never visited, researching attorneys who specialized in elder law and property disputes. She needed someone who would take her seriously, someone who wouldn't look at her gray hair and trembling hands and see only a confused old woman spinning paranoid tales about her husband. She found Patricia Chen. Patricia was young, barely 40, Margaret guessed, with sharp eyes and a direct manner that Margaret found instantly reassuring. Her office was small but neat, decorated with diplomas and family photographs. When Margaret sat down across from her desk and began to explain what had happened, Patricia listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Margaret finished, Patricia was silent for a long moment. "Mrs. Collins," she said finally, "what your husband has done is a crime. Forging your signature on a power of attorney is fraud. Selling marital property without your consent is illegal. You have grounds not only to contest the sale, but to pursue criminal charges if you choose." Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. Hearing it spoken aloud by a professional in an office in plain legal terms made it suddenly, terrifyingly real. "Can I stop it?" she asked. "Can I save my home?" Patricia nodded slowly. "The sale can be contested. It won't be easy and it won't be quick. But yes, Mrs. Collins, the law is on your side." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt something like hope. Over the following days, she gathered her evidence. She returned to Harold's study whenever he left the house, her heart pounding as she photographed documents with the cheap cell phone her daughter had insisted she carry. Transfer papers, bank statements, the forged power of attorney. Each photograph was another brick in the wall she was building, a wall that would eventually come crashing down on Harold's carefully constructed lies. She opened a bank account at a branch across town, depositing small amounts from the grocery money Harold gave her each week. It wasn't much, a few $100s, barely enough to matter, but it was hers. Something he couldn't touch, something that belonged only to her. She made copies of everything and stored them in a safe deposit box at the same bank. She memorized important dates and names. She prepared herself for every possible scenario, running through conversations in her mind like a general planning for battle. And through it all, she smiled at Harold. She cooked his eggs. She kissed his cheek before bed. She waited. The new owners were scheduled to take possession of the house on a Monday morning in late October. Patricia had confirmed the date after reviewing the sale documents. Margaret had less than 2 weeks to prepare, 2 weeks to ensure that everything was in place, that every piece of evidence was documented, that her case was airtight. The days passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret found herself hyper-aware of every detail, the way the autumn light fell through the windows, the smell of coffee in the morning, the creak of the third step from the bottom. She was memorizing her home, she realized, committing it to memory in case she lost it forever. She wouldn't let that happen. She couldn't. But the fear was always there, lurking beneath her resolve like a shadow. On the Sunday night before the confrontation, Margaret lay awake once more. Harold slept beside her, oblivious as always. The house was silent except for the ticking of the hallway clock and the occasional groan of settling wood. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, she would stand on her own front porch and face the consequences of her husband's betrayal. She would look him in the eyes and let him see, finally, completely, that she knew what he had done. She was terrified, but she was ready. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the wind. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked. A car passed on the distant highway. The world turned on, indifferent to the drama about to unfold in one small house in Ohio. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, the reckoning. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. Margaret woke before dawn, as she always did. But today she did not go to the kitchen. She did not make coffee. She did not stand at the window watching the light touch her garden. Instead, she dressed carefully in the quiet darkness. A simple navy blouse, her good wool cardigan, the pearl earrings her mother had given her on her wedding day. She wanted to look dignified. She wanted to look like a woman who deserved respect. When she descended the stairs, Harold was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a nervous energy she had never seen in him before. He glanced up when she entered, his eyes flickering with something, guilt, perhaps, or anticipation. "You're up early," he said, his voice falsely casual. "So are you," Margaret replied. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, the first pale light of morning crept across the yard. They waited. At precisely 8 o'clock, a moving truck rumbled down their quiet street. Margaret watched through the window as it pulled into their driveway, followed by a modest sedan. A young couple emerged, a man and woman in their early 30s, dressed in jeans and sweaters, their faces bright with excitement. They looked kind. They looked innocent. They had no idea what they were walking into. Harold stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "I'll handle this," he said, moving toward the front door. "You just stay here, Margaret. There's no need for you to—" "No." The words stopped him mid-stride. He turned slowly, his face registering confusion, then alarm. Margaret rose from her chair. Her legs trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "I said no, Harold. I'm not staying inside. And you're not handling anything, not anymore." Before he could respond, she walked past him, opened the front door, and stepped onto the porch. The young couple was already approaching the house, their smiles faltering as they sensed something wrong. But it was not Margaret who greeted them first. It was Patricia Chen, who emerged from a car parked at the curb, a car Margaret had arranged to have waiting since 7:30. Patricia walked up the driveway with calm authority, a leather folder tucked under her arm, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. "Good morning," Patricia said, addressing the confused couple. "I'm Patricia Chen, attorney for Mrs. Margaret Collins. I'm afraid there's been a serious legal issue with this property sale that we need to discuss before anyone proceeds further." The young woman blinked. "Legal issue? What do you mean? We signed all the papers. Everything was finalized." "The documents were obtained through fraud," Patricia replied evenly. "Mrs. Collins's signature on the power of attorney was forged. She never consented to this sale. The transaction is being formally contested as of this morning, and I would strongly advise you to contact your own attorney before taking any further action." The couple exchanged horrified glances. The man pulled out his phone, stepping away to make a call. The woman stared at Margaret with a mixture of pity and confusion. And Harold. Harold stood frozen in the doorway, his face ashen. Margaret turned to face him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind stirred the fallen leaves at their feet. The moving truck idled in the driveway, its engine a low rumble beneath the silence. "Margaret," Harold finally said, his voice cracking. "Please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. "Explain how you forged my signature, how you sold our home behind my back, how you lied to me every single day for months?" Harold's mouth opened, then closed. He looked suddenly old, older than she had ever seen him. His shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. "I didn't have a choice," he whispered. "There were debts, mistakes I made. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "You weren't protecting me, Harold. You were erasing me. You treated me like I was nothing, like 41 years of marriage meant nothing." Tears spilled down Harold's cheeks. He reached for her arm, but she stepped back. "Margaret, please." "No." Her voice broke slightly, but she held his gaze. "You don't get to touch me. You don't get to explain. You get to leave." The silence that followed was absolute. Harold stared at her, the woman he had underestimated, dismissed, betrayed, and in his eyes, Margaret saw something she had never expected to see. Fear. He was afraid of her now. Good. The weeks that followed were not easy. They were filled with lawyers and paperwork, court dates and difficult conversations. Margaret signed documents she barely understood, answered questions that made her relive the betrayal again and again, sat in cold waiting rooms while strangers decided the fate of her home and her marriage. There were moments when she wanted to collapse, to surrender, to let the exhaustion swallow her whole. But she didn't. She kept moving forward, one step at a time, because that was what survivors did. The sale of the house was voided within 3 weeks. Patricia Chen had built an airtight case. The forged power of attorney was submitted to handwriting experts who confirmed what Margaret had known the moment she saw it. The signature was not hers. Bank records revealed that Harold had been hiding substantial gambling debts, accumulated over years of secret visits to a casino 2 hours away. He had sold the house not out of malice, he claimed, but out of desperation. Margaret didn't care about his reasons. Desperation didn't excuse forgery. Fear didn't justify betrayal. Whatever demons Harold had been fighting, he had chosen to sacrifice her to save himself. That was a choice she could never forgive. The young couple who had purchased the house were sympathetic once they understood the situation. They withdrew their claim without contest, grateful to have discovered the fraud before they had fully moved in. They even sent Margaret a card, a simple note, expressing their hope that she would find peace. She kept that card on her refrigerator for months afterward. It reminded her that kindness still existed in the world. Harold moved out on a cold November morning. He packed his belongings into boxes while Margaret sat in the living room, watching without speaking. He moved slowly, his shoulders hunched, his face gray with shame. He paused several times as if waiting for her to say something, to forgive him perhaps, or to ask him to stay. She said nothing. When the last box was loaded into his car, Harold stood in the doorway of the home they had shared for 37 years. His eyes were red. His hands trembled at his sides. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I am. I'm so sorry." Margaret looked at him, this man she had loved, trusted, built a life with, and felt something unexpected, not anger, not hatred, just a profound, aching sadness. "Goodbye, Harold," she said quietly. He nodded once, then turned and walked to his car. She watched him drive away until his taillights disappeared around the corner. Then she closed the door, leaned against it, and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for months. He was gone. She was still here. The divorce was finalized in early spring. Margaret received the house, free and clear. She received a portion of Harold's retirement savings, what remained after his debts were paid. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to live on, enough to start over. Her children came to visit more often now. Daniel flew in from Colorado with his boys, who filled the house with noise and laughter and sticky fingerprints on the windows. Sarah drove up from Michigan and spent long evenings on the porch with Margaret, drinking tea and talking about everything and nothing. They didn't pity her. They admired her. "You're the strongest person I know, Mom," Sarah said one night, her eyes glistening. "I don't know how you did it." Margaret smiled and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "I just had to keep going." As the months passed, the house began to feel different. Not empty, never empty, but lighter somehow. Margaret repainted the bedroom in soft shades of blue, a color she had always loved but Harold had never liked. She rearranged the furniture. She hung new photographs on the walls, pictures of her grandchildren, her garden, a sunset she had captured on her phone one evening when the sky turned impossibly pink. She planted new roses in the spring, pink ones, white ones, deep, velvety reds. She started attending a book club at the library. She volunteered at the church food pantry. She learned to be alone without being lonely, a skill she had never thought she would need, but now treasured. One evening, as the sun set over her garden in shades of gold and amber, Margaret sat on her porch with a cup of tea and realized something remarkable. She was happy, not the happiness of her youth, bright and naive and untested. This was something deeper, something earned. The quiet contentment of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged, scarred but whole, on the other side. She had lost a husband, but she had found herself. A year passed. The seasons turned in their eternal rhythm, summer fading to autumn, autumn surrendering to winter, winter melting into spring. The garden bloomed and withered and bloomed again. The old house settled deeper into its foundations, creaking and groaning with the wisdom of decades. And Margaret Collins, now 64 years old, sat on her porch one mild evening in late May, watching the fireflies blink their tiny lanterns across the darkening yard. She thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the discovery, the long, painful fight to reclaim what was rightfully hers. She thought about Harold, living now with his sister in another state, a broken man consumed by shame and regret. She thought about the woman she had been before all of this, and the woman she had become. They were not the same person, and that, Margaret realized, was not a tragedy. It was a gift. The lesson of her story was not complicated. It didn't require elaborate philosophy or grand pronouncements. It was simple, as the deepest truths often are. And if Margaret could share it with anyone willing to listen, anyone who had ever loved too much, trusted too deeply, or lost themselves in the service of another, it would be this: trust is sacred. But so is self-worth. We are taught from childhood to give ourselves to those we love, to sacrifice, to compromise, to put others first. And there is beauty in that teaching, real beauty, the kind that builds families and communities and holds the fragile fabric of society together. But somewhere along the way, many of us forget something essential. We forget that we matter too. We forget that love should never require the erasure of self, that a true partnership lifts both people up rather than diminishing one for the benefit of the other. That trust, once given, must be honored, not exploited. Margaret had spent 41 years giving everything to her marriage, her youth, her dreams, her labor, her heart. She had done so willingly, joyfully, believing that Harold was giving equally in return, and perhaps, for many years, he was. But when he chose to betray her, when he forged her signature, sold her home, and treated her as an obstacle rather than a partner, he broke the sacred covenant of their union. He revealed that his love had limits, that his respect had conditions, that she was, in the end, less important to him than his own secrets and fears. And Margaret had to make a choice. She could accept the betrayal. She could shrink into silence, as she had been shrinking for months, and let Harold's actions define her fate. She could become the victim he had assumed she would be, old, helpless, invisible. Or she could remember who she was. She could remember the strength that had carried her through decades of quiet struggle, the resilience that had never demanded recognition, the dignity that belonged to her, regardless of what anyone else believed. She chose to fight, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the calm, steady determination of a woman who finally understood her own worth. And that is the heart of this story, not the betrayal, not the courtroom drama, not even the satisfying moment when justice was served and Margaret reclaimed her home. The heart of this story is simpler than that. It is the truth that strength does not always roar. Sometimes strength is quiet. Sometimes it waits patiently in the shadows, unnoticed and underestimated. until the moment it is needed most. Margaret Collins was never weak. She had simply been asleep, lulled by routine and trust, into forgetting the power that lived inside her. When she woke up, she became unstoppable. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of Margaret's journey. She sits on her porch now, watching the fireflies dance, listening to the crickets sing their ancient songs. Her grandchildren will visit next weekend. Her roses are blooming beautifully this year. The house, her house, stands solid and warm behind her, filled with memories both painful and precious. She is not the same woman she was a year ago. She is better. She has learned that betrayal, as devastating as it is, does not have to destroy you. That loss can become transformation. That the darkest chapters of our lives can lead us, if we are brave enough to keep walking, into the light. And if her story can offer one gift to those who hear it, let it be this. No matter how long you have loved someone, never lose yourself in the process. Your worth is not negotiable. Your dignity is not for sale. And your strength, quiet as it may be, is always there, waiting for you to claim it. What would you do if you discovered someone you loved had betrayed you this deeply? Share your thoughts in the comments below.